This move opens lines for the queen and bishop, immediately contesting the center and preparing for rapid development, a common and strong start to many opening systems. This move symmetrically mirrors white's central pawn advance, immediately contesting the d4 square and opening diagonals for black's queen and bishop, leading to a vast array of classical opening possibilities. Developing the knight to f3 controls the central d4 square and prepares for kingside castling, a fundamental step in most openings for king safety. This move develops a knight to a natural square, defending the e5 pawn and preparing for further development, entering standard openings like the Yuri-Lopez or Italian game. This move initiates the Yuri-Lopez, a classical opening aiming to control the center and pressure black's knight, potentially leading to an advantageous pawn structure if black is forced to defend passively. This move, known as the Morphy defense, immediately challenges the bishop and seeks to gain space on the queenside while preparing to develop the queenside pieces. This move maintains the Yuri-Lopez opening by retreating the bishop, avoiding the pawn capture and preparing to develop other pieces efficiently. Developing the knight to f6 is a natural and active response, challenging white's e4 pawn and preparing to castle, while also contesting control of the d5 square within the Yuri-Lopez opening. Castling kingside secures the king behind a protective pawn shield and activates the rook for future central control or action on the open files. This move, developing the bishop and preparing to castle, is a standard and logical response within the Yuri-Lopez opening, solidifying black's kingside defense and facilitating future piece coordination. This move repositions the rook to a central file, preparing to challenge black's control of the e-file and potentially support an e5 pawn push later in the game, while also safeguarding the king. This move, 6b5, is a standard response in the Yuri-Lopez, aiming to gain space on the queenside and challenge white's bishop's position after its retreat. This retreat maintains the pin on the c6 knight and prepares for further pawn advances in the center while keeping the bishop actively defending the kingside. This move solidifies the central pawn structure and prepares to develop the queenside pieces, while also opening the diagonal for the queen towards the kingside. This move prepares to support the d4 pawn push, aiming to seize more central space and challenge black's pieces. Black castles kingside, a standard prophylactic move to secure the king and connect the rooks, preparing for central play. This move prevents the bishop on a4 from being harassed by a subsequent g5 push, solidifying white's control over the center and preparing for further development. This move, b-7, continues the development of black's pieces and reinforces the c6 knight while preparing to contest the open d-file and potentially pressure white's queenside pawns. This central pawn push directly challenges black's control of the center and aims to open lines for white's pieces, typical of many Yuri-Lopez variations. This move reinforces the e5 pawn and prepares to challenge white's central pawn on d4, potentially leading to a more open position for black. This move develops the knight to a centralizing square, preparing to support a central pawn push with e4 e5 or to redeploy to f1 and then g3 for kingside activity. This move retreats the bishop to a more passive square, potentially preparing to reroute it to c5 or b6 after supporting the d6 pawn. This retreat of the bishop from c2 preserves it from the potential harassment by black's pawns on the queenside and repositions it to a more active diagonal, supporting the central advance. This move prepares to fianchetto the bishop, aiming to control the long dark squared diagonal and provide a safer haven for the king on the kingside. This move prepares to fianchetto the light-squared bishop to b2, supporting the center and potentially creating pressure along the long diagonal. The move bg7 solidifies the bishop's position on the long diagonal, preparing to contest control of the center and potentially support kingside play. This move strategically secures white's central pawn majority and restricts black's kingside play by closing the d-file, aiming to transition into a queenside attack or a space advantage. This move initiates a knight repositioning, aiming to redeploy the knight from the queenside to a more active square, likely f8 or e6, to support the central pawn structure and potentially attack on the kingside. This knight maneuver is preparing to reroute to g3 or h2, aiming to support a kingside attack or reinforce the kingside pawn structure while the d-pawn advance has opened lines. Black challenges the central pawn control with a pawn break on the queenside, aiming to create counterplay and open lines for the rooks. This move aims to solidify white's queenside space and potentially challenge black's pawn structure, preparing for a potential central advance or a queenside pawn storm. This move opens the c-file, creating dynamic possibilities for both sides, and challenging white's central pawn presence while preparing to develop the bishop to a more active square. This exchange opens the c-file, creating a strategic opportunity for white to exert pressure on black's queenside and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares. This move is a natural repositioning of the knight, aiming to activate it on a more central square like e5 or g5, potentially supporting a d5 pawn push or preparing for future pawn breaks. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to support a potential kingside pawn advance or exert pressure on black's queenside. The move 18, rc8 intensifies pressure on the semi-open c-file, directly challenging white's control and preparing potential breakthroughs for black's pieces. This move initiates a fight for queenside space and attempts to exploit the weaknesses created by black's pawn structure after cxd5, potentially opening lines for white's pieces. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to contest white's central control and potentially prepare for future pawn advances or piece exchanges on the queenside. This move reroutes the knight to a more active square on f2, aiming to support the central pawns and potentially swing over to the kingside for an attack, while also defending against black's queenside pressure. Black captures on a4, opening the b-file and creating a favorable pawn structure on the queenside, while white must decide whether to recapture with the pawn or the knight. This move opens the b-file for white's rook and challenges black's pawn structure, aiming to gain space and activate white's pieces on the queenside. This move repositions the knight to a more active outpost, aiming to disrupt white's control of the queenside and potentially create attacking chances on the a-file or the light squares. This capture on a4 aims to exploit the vulnerability of black's b3 pawn and open lines for white's rooks, potentially leading to an initiative on the queenside. This move aims to challenge white's strong knight on d2 by offering a knight exchange, forcing a decision that could either simplify the position or create new weaknesses for white if they avoid the exchange. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the queenside and preparing to support a potential advance of the a-pawn. The knight redeploys to d7, a flexible square that supports the central pawn push and prepares to reinforce the kingside if needed, while also keeping options open for a potential transposition into different strategic plans. The queen repositions to b1 to support the pawn push on b4, aiming to exploit the open queenside files and potentially attack the knight on d7. This knight retreat aims to reinforce the d7 square and prepare for a future central pawn push or repositioning to a more active square like c5 or e6. This exchange on d4, while clearing black's knight from its cramped position, opens the c-file for white's rook and allows black's queenside pawns to become more active. The exchange on d4 opens lines for white's pieces and creates a central pawn majority, while black's pieces are activated and gain potential counterplay on the queenside. This pawn thrust creates an immediate tension on the queenside, aiming to gain space and potentially open the b-file for white's rook. Capturing the pawn opens the a-file for white's rook and allows black's knight to reach a more active square on d4, potentially forcing exchanges or creating central pressure. This move wins back the pawn lost earlier and maintains queenside pressure by attacking the vulnerable b5 pawn. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, aiming to contest control of the 7th rank and potentially support a pawn advance or pressure white's queenside structure. This knight maneuver to c4 targets black's vulnerable queenside pawns and aims to increase pressure on the c-file, potentially leading to tactical opportunities or positional gains by disrupting black's coordination. This move retreats the bishop to a more passive square, allowing white to solidify their central control and potentially prepare further pawn advancements. This move activates the knight to a strong central outpost, putting pressure on black's pawn structure and preparing for further advances on the queenside. This move activates the rook on the 3rd rank, potentially aiming to exploit the open c-file for future pressure or to defend against white's potential threats on that same file. This move redirects the rook to the 1st rank, preparing to challenge black's rook on the c-file and potentially create counterplay against white's queenside pawn structure. The rook moves to a more active file, connecting with the queen and supporting potential advances on the queenside. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing the weak f7 pawn and creating potential threats along the 4th rank while defending the vulnerable b4 pawn. This move re-establishes the rook's presence on the open c-file, a critical strategic objective that was temporarily relinquished, and prepares for potential advances or defensive maneuvers along the file. This move recaptures a pawn, but by exchanging queens, white simplifies the position while black's pieces are somewhat uncoordinated and could become vulnerable to further pressure. This move actively contests the open file and prepares to challenge white's queenside control, aiming to create counterplay and disrupt white's pawn structure. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, intending to challenge black's control of the d4 pawn and potentially support a kingside advance. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to control key central squares and potentially support a kingside pawn advance or pressure white's queenside. The move k3 aims to reroute the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting a kingside attack or reinforcing the center while preparing for further pawn advances. Black repositions the rook to the 3rd rank, preparing to attack the b-pawn and potentially disrupt white's control of the c-file. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, potentially preparing for a central push or to support an attack on the kingside. This move seeks to exploit the open c-file and increase pressure on white's queenside, aiming to coordinate the rook with the queen and potentially attack the vulnerable b2 pawn. This move re-establishes the knight on a strong central square, aiming to support the pawn on c4 and contest control of the d-file after black's rook has moved to the c-file. This exchange clears black's 7th rank, preparing to bring the rook from c3 into the action and potentially exploit the weakened structure around white's king. This capture removes a key defender of black's kingside and opens the d-file, potentially leading to an attack on black's remaining pawns. The knight's return to a6 aims to reroute through c7 to attack white's d5 pawn, a key central stronghold, and also prepares to contest the c-file should it open further. This move repositions the bishop from its previously pinned status to a more active central square, reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing to contest the d-file or support potential central advances. This move begins an interesting attempt to gain space on the kingside and potentially disrupt white's central control by creating a passed pawn threat. This rook maneuver repositions the piece to the queenside, aiming to support the pawn advance on the a-file and potentially pressure black's queenside pawn structure. This move is a defensive retreat, repositioning the rook to a more active square on the c-file, which now becomes semi-open and can potentially put pressure on white's central pawns and kings defense. This maneuver aims to redeploy the rook to a more active square, potentially preparing for a coordinated attack on black's queenside or to contest the crucial c-file. This move seeks to untangle the rook from the g-file and potentially create counterplay on the queenside by activating the rook and freeing up the b-pawn. White repositions the knight to the rim, aiming to contest the important b4 square and prepare a potential advance of the queenside pawns. The move is strategically aimed at preparing to contest the open c-file with the rook, while simultaneously unpinning the knight on a6 and allowing it to potentially become more active by challenging white's queenside control. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting potential central advances and defending the weakened light squares. This move aims to reposition the rook to a more active file, potentially targeting white's queenside pawns or creating counterplay along the third rank. The rook on b3 is repositioned to defend the vulnerable b3 pawn and potentially offer support to the c4 knight on its next move, aiming to consolidate white's position after the active rook play. This move directly challenges white's queen and prepares to redistribute black's rook and queen to more active squares, aiming to exploit the undefended b3 pawn.